Don't speak to him. He's only the butler, my daughter-in-law said loudly enough for 50 Thanksgiving guests to hear, and the room that I had paid for, prepared, and filled with people suddenly went silent. A few nervous laughs followed. Someone set down a wine glass. Someone else looked away. I stood there holding a serving tray, feeling every eye in the room slide over me as if I were a stranger in my own home. "Michelle," I said quietly, "I think you're confused." She smiled without warmth. "Am I? Then why don't you let the Real hosts handle the evening?" My son David stepped closer and hissed, "Dad, please. Not now." I looked at him, and somehow that hurt more than anything she had said. Then I smiled. A small smile. The kind that appears when you finally understand something important. "You've forgotten who pays the bills," I told them. David's face went pale. Michelle's confident expression flickered for just a second. And that was the moment everything began to change. Before I tell you what happened next, if this story truly resonates with you, consider liking and subscribing, but only if it speaks to your heart. And I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Tell me your city or country and your local time in the comments. My name is George Thompson. I'm 72 years old, and this was the Thanksgiving night that changed everything I believed about my family. The lesson hidden inside this story took me decades to learn, and if you stay until the end, you may discover something about trust, respect, and family that I learned the hard way. And now, let me tell you where it all began. 3 days before that dinner, my house in Newport, Rhode Island, smelled of cinnamon, roasted turkey, and fresh-baked pies. I had spent nearly 12 hours preparing for Thanksgiving. My knees ached. My back complained every time I climbed the stairs. But I was happy. Family mattered to me. It always had. My granddaughter Emily stood on a ladder hanging autumn decorations across the dining room archway. "Grandpa, nobody does Thanksgiving like you," she said with a grin. "That's because your grandfather is old-fashioned," I replied. "And proud of it." She laughed. "Don't ever change." Looking back, I think she was trying to tell me something else that day. Something she didn't know how to say. Later that afternoon, I noticed Michelle standing on the back patio, speaking on her phone. Her voice was low, sharp, serious. When she saw me through the window, she immediately ended the call. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Perfect," she answered too quickly. Then she walked away. That night, Emily lingered after everyone else left. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, turning a mug of hot chocolate between her hands. "Grandpa?" she asked softly. "Yes, sweetheart." She hesitated. "Have you ever felt like people stop seeing who you really are?" The question caught me off guard. "Why would you ask that?" Emily looked toward the dark window. "No reason." Then she forced a smile and changed the subject. At the time, I let it go. I wish I hadn't. Because as I watched her leave that evening, I noticed something tucked halfway out of her backpack, a printed document with my name on it. And what I saw in the corner of that page made my stomach tighten with a fear I couldn't explain. The early mornings in my childhood home in Providence, Rhode Island, were always quiet, punctuated by the creak of the floorboards and the faint hum of the old furnace. My mother, Clara Thompson, would be in the kitchen before sunrise, brewing coffee strong enough to wake the entire block and arranging the breakfast dishes with meticulous care. "George, do not spill your milk again," she would say, her voice firm but not unkind, as I fumbled with the glass on the wooden table. My father, Henry, often sat reading the newspaper, occasionally glancing up at my sister and me with a look of detached affection, the kind that made it clear he was proud but preferred not to show it openly. Birthdays were a particular kind of theater. I remember my 10th birthday, the living room adorned with streamers that drooped slightly from the old plaster ceiling, the chocolate cake slightly lopsided, and my cousin Daniel leaning against the doorframe, smirking. "Better luck next year," he whispered. My parents laughed along with everyone else, but I noticed the way they looked at him first, ensuring his enjoyment over mine. The smallest details carried weight. My chair positioned just a little further from the head of the table, the fork slightly smaller than the others. Even the family dog seemed to sense the hierarchy, nudging the guests for affection while ignoring me. I would sit there silently, biting my lip, aware of every whisper, every sideways glance. "George, come here," my mother would call, and I would rise, feeling the heaviness of expectation. The truth was, I learned early that love could be conditional, tied to appearances, achievements, and obedience. When my father called for the family photograph, I noticed the deliberate positioning. cousins in the center, me at the periphery. "Smile," he said, but I felt more like a prop than a son in his own home. Over time, these moments etched a quiet resilience in me, an understanding that I would need to hold my head high even when overlooked or dismissed. These lessons carried me through high school, into my first apartment in Boston, and eventually into adulthood where I would work long hours, save every penny, and meticulously prepare for the family gatherings that meant so much to me. And yet, despite the careful planning and devotion, I learned that preparation and good intentions were not always enough to earn respect or recognition. As I moved through the kitchen arranging plates for our Thanksgiving feast in Newport, the same feeling returned. A whisper of that old hurt mingled with the aroma of roasting turkey and spiced cider. Emily, my granddaughter, noticed the tension as she carefully set the candlesticks. "Grandpa, why do you look so tense?" she asked softly. I forced a smile. "Just thinking, sweetheart, just thinking." But deep down, I felt the familiar stir of anxiety, the same uncertainty that had followed me from childhood to this very evening. And as I glanced toward the window and saw shadows flit across the patio, I wondered if some unspoken plan, some hidden tension, was already unfolding outside, ready to challenge everything I thought I understood about family, loyalty, and trust. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the dining room, I found myself arranging the final centerpiece with hands that were steady despite the tension in the air. Emily had placed the autumn leaves and tiny pumpkins perfectly along the table, her young fingers precise and careful, and I could not help but feel a swell of pride. "Grandpa, everything looks amazing," she whispered. I nodded, glancing toward the sideboard where the wine glasses caught the last rays of sunlight, sparkling like little diamonds. Then I heard Michelle's voice, low and sharp, speaking to David in the corner near the kitchen. "Do you really think he notices nothing?" she said, almost mockingly. David looked uncomfortable, rubbing his hand across his jaw, but did not answer. Normally, I might have intervened, lectured, or corrected the tension with a joke to diffuse it. But this time I did not. I let the words hang there, heavy, unheard by anyone else. For the first time in years, I simply observed. I noticed the way her smirk faltered for a fraction of a second when our eyes met. Just a fleeting recognition that her usual confidence did not reach me entirely. My opportunity had arrived, subtle but undeniable. I set the napkins down, folded just so, giving a slight nod to Emily to take her place at the head of the table, a small gesture that seemed to assert my presence without confrontation. "Grandpa," she asked, almost breathless, "do you think they know how hard you worked?" I smiled softly. "They will," I said, feeling a quiet surge of power settle in my chest. Across the room, I could sense the shift, small but perceptible, a change in the air as if everyone had just tilted slightly on their axis. Michelle adjusted her posture, now aware that I was not the man she assumed I would be tonight. David hesitated, his earlier unease deepening, sensing that some invisible current had turned against him, even if he could not yet name it. I let my gaze drift to the silverware, aligning the forks with exact precision, listening to the soft clinking of glasses as the first guests murmured greetings. Every detail mattered. Every action carried a message that only the attentive would perceive. I had learned patience from a lifetime of overlooked moments, and now, patience was a weapon sharper than any words. A shadow of a smile appeared on my face as I thought about the hidden ledger tucked away in my study, the evidence of careful planning, months of attention to detail that no one had suspected. Emily's hand brushed against mine as she seated herself, her eyes wide with understanding and excitement. And in that moment, I knew she sensed it too. "Something is about to happen, Grandpa, isn't it?" she asked softly, barely above a whisper. I nodded slightly, keeping my expression calm, though my heart raced with anticipation. The air had shifted entirely from the ordinary bustle of a family gathering to something charged with tension, the delicate balance of power quietly tilting, and I could feel that tonight. For the first time in years, the story of our family was about to be rewritten. I did not sleep that night. The house felt too large now, each hallway echoing with the absence of Noelle's voice, and even more painfully, with the silence of Wade's refusal to look me in the eye. By morning, I told myself I would fix it. I told myself that misunderstandings in families happened, that words spoken in anger could still be softened if enough care was applied. I picked up my phone and called Wade. The first ring went through. The second, then voicemail. His voice, once warm and familiar, now felt distant as it said, "Hi, you've reached Wade. Leave a message." I hesitated, then spoke quietly. "Wade, it's Mom. Please call me back. We need to talk about the house." About everything that was said. I waited for a reply that never came. An hour later, I sent an email. Subject line, "Please, let's talk." I wrote carefully, choosing every word like glass in my hands. I told him I did not understand why things had to be so final, that I was still grieving his father, that the house was not just property, but every memory I had left. I pressed send. No response. By afternoon, I tried Romy. She answered on the fourth ring. Her voice clipped, controlled, almost rehearsed. "Yes, Romy, I just want to understand," I said, forcing calm into my tone. 2 weeks is not enough time. This is my home. There was a short silence before she replied. "It was decided, Myrtle. You're making it harder than it needs to be." "Harder for who?" I asked, my voice breaking despite myself. "For you or for me?" She exhaled slowly, like I was a problem she had already solved. "Wade is busy. Please respect that." And then the line went dead. I stood in the kitchen holding the phone long after the call ended, staring at the silent screen like it might explain what had just happened. That evening, I wrote a letter by hand. My hands trembled slightly as I wrote Wade's name at the top. I told him about his childhood room, about the nights his father and I stayed awake when he had fevers, about the house he once called forever home. I did not accuse. I did not beg. I simply wrote the truth as I remembered it. I sealed it and drove to his house myself. From the street, I saw lights on inside. I saw movement. I stood on the porch for a long moment before placing the envelope carefully at the door. Before I could knock, I heard footsteps inside pause, then retreat. No one opened the door. The letter was never taken. The next day, I went to the bank as I had been told to prepare for my transition. The clerk spoke politely, but without warmth, confirming account adjustments Wade had already initiated. My name still existed on paper, but it no longer felt like mine. Days passed in repetition. I called again, left messages, wrote again. Each attempt returned nothing but silence. Even my closest neighbor, Mrs. Collins, began to speak carefully, as if she had been instructed not to take sides. "Maybe give them time," she said gently once, avoiding my eyes. Time, I realized, was not what they were offering me. Distance was. By the end of the week, I stopped calling altogether. Not because I accepted it, but because I finally understood no one was listening. The house remained the same, yet it no longer felt like a place I belonged to. I moved through its rooms quietly, as if I were visiting someone else's life. One evening, I sat at the dining table where we had once shared family dinners, and I placed my phone face down. It did not ring. It did not vibrate. It simply lay there, still and indifferent. I realized then that I was no longer part of their world. Not as a mother, not as a widow, not even as a memory they were willing to respond to. I sat in that silence until it became the only answer I had left. I sat in the living room, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the walls that had once felt warm with family laughter. The silence now was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath my own feet. Each room I passed reminded me of what had been lost, and of what was never coming back. The phone sat on the table, face up, still and unresponsive, no messages, no calls, nothing. I dialed Wade again, my hands trembling slightly. "Wade, it is Mom. I need to understand," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. The voicemail picked up. I tried again hours later. Same result. I typed a long email, detailing my thoughts, my grief, my longing to preserve even a fraction of the memories we shared. Sent it. Waited. No reply. By evening, I wrote a letter on my favorite stationery, addressed to both Wade and Romy, recounting moments from holidays past, the small gestures of love and care that had once held our family together. I left it at their door, footsteps careful, measured, as if the weight of my heart could be transferred through the envelope. The door did not open. The letter remained, untouched, the envelope crinkled slightly from the wind. I returned home, and for the first time, I realized that I was entirely alone in this house, in this grief, in this life. I walked through the kitchen, noticing the faint smell of Noelle's cologne still lingering near the pantry, a memory that made my chest ache. "Mom, we need to talk," I whispered to the empty room, my own voice the only answer. I tried calling friends, distant family, anyone who might offer some comfort. They spoke politely, but the distance in their voices made it clear that they were reluctant, unable, or unwilling to intervene. Even my neighbor, who had once greeted me with a warm smile, kept her words short and careful, as if fearing reprisal. I began to understand the magnitude of the isolation that had been imposed upon me. Not only had Wade and Romy removed themselves from my life, but they had effectively erased my presence, my role, my history. The house, the town, even the memories seemed to conspire in silence. Each morning, I moved through the rooms with deliberate slowness, touching objects carefully, tracing the familiar edges of furniture, the textures of the rugs, the frames of photographs, each one a fragment of a past that I could not reclaim. At night, I sat by the window, staring out into the darkened yard, the stars above indifferent to my sorrow. I acknowledged, for the first time, that grief was not only about loss, but about recognition. The recognition that those I had nurtured, those I had trusted, were no longer allies in this life. And yet, as I sat there, a subtle shift began. Not hope, not yet, but a quiet awareness that this isolation, this emptiness, could be the space in which I might rebuild. I would remember the warmth, preserve it quietly, and in that preservation, find the first fragile strands of strength to emerge from the deepest shadows. I began to rebuild my days with a kind of discipline that did not depend on anyone else. The silence in the house was no longer something I waited to be broken, but something I organized my life around. Each morning I woke before sunrise, made coffee, and wrote down what I could still control. Not what I had lost, but what remained within reach. One morning, I drove downtown and stopped in front of a small community center that offered administrative support classes and part-time coordination work. The building was modest, brick-worn by years of weather, but inside there was movement, conversation, purpose. A woman at the front desk looked up and smiled politely. "Can I help you?" she asked. I nodded. "I am looking for work. Something structured. Something useful." She studied me for a moment, then handed me a form. "We actually need someone to help organize senior outreach programs," she said. "It is part-time, but it matters." I filled out the application right there, my handwriting steady, deliberate. 2 days later, I received a call. "Mrs. Myrtle, this is Janet from the center. We would like you to come in for a meeting." When I arrived, Janet greeted me with a firm handshake. "We read your experience," she said. "You managed household operations for decades. That counts more than you think." I replied quietly, "I managed a life. That is what I am hoping to do again." She smiled. "We can start you next week." I did not wait for permission from the past. I began organizing small events, coordinating volunteers, setting schedules. The work was simple at first, but it gave shape to my days. One afternoon, a younger staff member looked at me curiously. "You are surprisingly calm under pressure," she said. I answered without hesitation. "Pressure is just another form of silence. You learn to hear what it is telling you." Outside of work, I slowly rebuilt connections that were not tied to obligation or history. Mrs. Collins, my neighbor, stopped by one evening holding a small pie. "I thought you might like company," she said gently. We sat at the kitchen table, and for the first time in weeks, I shared a meal without waiting for disappointment to follow. "You seem different," she observed carefully. I looked at her and said, "I stopped waiting for people who are not coming." She nodded, as if she understood more than she said. Weeks passed. I opened a small account for consulting work, helping older residents navigate paperwork and housing applications. Word spread quietly, not through family, but through strangers who valued clarity and patience. One afternoon, a young administrator from the center approached me. "We have been hearing requests for you specifically," she said. "People trust how you explain things." I paused, then replied, "Trust is built when no one is watching." She wrote something down, then looked up. "There is talk about expanding the program. They might want you to lead it." That evening, I stood on the porch watching the sky shift into soft gold. The house behind me no longer felt like a container of absence, but a starting point that had finally been emptied for something new. My phone remained quiet, but I no longer checked it for meaning. Instead, I opened my notebook and wrote a single line. "I am still here, and I am still becoming." As the wind moved through the trees, I allowed myself, for the first time, to imagine that what I was building might not only sustain me, but eventually grow beyond anything I had been allowed to be before. I did not notice the moment it changed, only that one day the center was no longer a small building with borrowed chairs and quiet mornings, but a structured organization with nameplates on every door and schedules printed on glass boards. My name was no longer written on a temporary sheet at the front desk. It was on the wall. Program Coordinator, Myrtle H. I stood there for a long moment, reading it again as if repetition might make it feel less unreal. Janet approached from behind, her footsteps steady. "We finalized your role," she said. "You will be leading the Senior Outreach Division starting today." I turned to her slowly. "Leading?" I asked. She nodded. "You already have been, in everything but title." That morning, they handed me a badge. A simple white card with black lettering. Myrtle H., Senior Program Coordinator. I held it between my fingers longer than necessary, feeling its weight not in plastic, but in meaning. The first time I walked through the building wearing it, people looked up differently. Not with pity, not with hesitation, but with recognition. A man at the reception desk stood as I passed. "Good morning, Coordinator," he said. I replied calmly, "Good morning. Let us begin the day on time." Meetings no longer waited for approval from others. I led them. I spoke less than I used to, but when I did, the room listened. One afternoon, a younger staff member hesitated before speaking. "We were not sure if we should escalate the housing issue to you," she said. I looked at the file, then at her. "If it affects people who cannot speak loudly for themselves, it comes to me," I said. She nodded quickly. "Understood." Outside the center, my life no longer moved in silence. There were calls, schedules, responsibilities that required presence, not permission. I began attending city advisory meetings, seated not in the back, but at the table marked with a printed name card bearing my title. The first time I saw it, I did not react. I simply placed my notes beside it and waited for the meeting to begin. During a session on community aging support, a city official glanced at me. "Coordinator Myrtle, your program has reduced missed appointments by nearly 40%, he said. I replied evenly. "People do not miss what they feel they belong to." He paused, then nodded as if the answer had weight beyond numbers. One evening, after a long day, I stood in front of the center's glass entrance. My reflection showed a woman I barely recognized from the months before. Not softened by absence, not diminished by silence, but structured by purpose. My hair was tied back neatly. My posture was steady. The badge on my jacket caught the streetlight as I moved. Mrs. Collins passed by that evening and stopped briefly. "You look like someone people follow now," she said with a small smile. I answered simply. I stopped waiting for permission to be seen. She touched my arm lightly before walking on. There was no need for more words. Weeks later, I was invited to speak at a regional community summit. The auditorium was larger than anything I had ever stood in before. My name appeared on the screen behind the podium. Myrtle H., Senior Program Coordinator, Community Outreach Division. I stepped up, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at a room full of strangers who were no longer strangers by choice, but by timing. "I used to think silence meant absence," I said calmly. "Now I understand it can also mean rebuilding." I did not look for approval. I did not wait for reaction. I simply continued, because now my voice had a place to land. After the event, a young organizer approached me. "People are already requesting your program model for other cities," she said. I nodded once. "Then it is ready," I replied. That evening, I returned home later than usual. The house was still the same, but I no longer moved through it as someone waiting to be remembered. I placed my badge on the table beside the keys, and for the first time, I did not feel the need to check for silence, because I was no longer inside it. And as the clock ticked forward into the present moment, I understood clearly that my life was no longer something I was trying to recover. It was something I was already living again. I had not returned to that part of the city in a long time, but the message came without warning, short and formal, asking me to attend a family medical consultation regarding Wade's condition. No explanation beyond that. No warmth. Just an address, a time, and a silence between the lines that felt intentional. I stood in my home that morning holding the printed notice, reading it twice, then a third time. Not because I did not understand it, but because I was trying to understand why now. The hospital lobby was too bright when I arrived, the kind of brightness that makes everything feel exposed. I walked slowly to the reception desk. The woman behind it looked up. "Name?" she asked. "Myrtle," I said. "I am here for Wade." She checked the screen, then pointed down the hallway. Room 312. Family meeting already started. The word family landed strangely. I walked past rows of chairs, past people speaking in low voices, until I reached the glass door. Inside, I could see Wade seated at a table with a hospital administrator and a nurse. Romy stood beside him, arms folded, speaking quietly but firmly. When I entered, the room shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, but enough for all conversation to pause. Wade looked up first. His face was thinner than I remembered. "Mom," he said, as if testing whether the words still belonged to him. I stepped inside. "You did not tell me it was urgent," I said calmly. Romy did not move closer. She only tilted her head slightly. "We did not want to alarm you," she said. I looked at her, then at Wade. "Alarm me about what?" The nurse cleared her throat and adjusted a file in front of her. "We are reviewing discharge planning and long-term care arrangements," she said carefully. Wade exhaled and rubbed his forehead. "Mom, I have been struggling," he said. "Work has been a lot. I cannot manage everything and—" He paused, then glanced at Romy. She finished the sentence for him. "And it is time to consider structured care support for everyone involved." The words were precise, rehearsed, like they had been repeated before I arrived. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I sat down in the empty chair across from them. Slowly, deliberately. "Everyone involved," I repeated softly. Romy nodded once. "It is the responsible option." I looked at Wade. His eyes did not meet mine for long. "Do you agree with this?" I asked him directly. He hesitated. The pause stretched longer than comfort allowed. "I think it is complicated," he said finally. I nodded once, as if acknowledging something already understood. The doctor entered then, placing a chart on the table. "Mrs. Myrtle, we are also discussing medical power of attorney updates," he said. "Given the circumstances, your role in decision-making may need to be reviewed." I leaned back slightly in my chair. The room felt smaller now, not because of space, but because of intent. "Reviewed by who?" I asked. No one answered immediately. Romy glanced at Wade, then back at me. "This is standard procedure," she said. I studied her face carefully, then the papers on the table, then the way Wade's hands stayed folded, as if holding himself together. "Standard," I repeated quietly. The nurse slid a document toward me. "We just need your acknowledgement," she said. I looked down at it, but did not take it. Instead, I asked one simple question. "When was this decided?" The room went still. Wade shifted in his chair. Romy's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "It has been discussed for some time," she said carefully. I nodded again, slowly. "Some time," I repeated. The doctor began speaking again, explaining procedures, legal steps, responsibilities, but I was no longer listening fully. I watched their faces instead. Wade's avoidance, Romy's control, the careful alignment of words that had clearly been chosen before I arrived. Then the doctor said something that changed the temperature of the room entirely. "Your financial and residential arrangements will also need immediate review," he said. And for the first time, Romy's gaze did not leave mine. I took a slow breath, letting the tension in the hospital conference room settle into something I could control. The papers on the table had been shuffled, highlighted, initialed, each mark a calculated attempt to direct the outcome. I looked at Wade first, then at Romy, and spoke evenly. "It appears all decisions have been made without my input. That ends now." Wade's lips parted, as if to respond, but he hesitated, unsure if the words he wanted to say would carry weight. "Mom, he started. I did not interrupt. I held up a hand and continued. "I am fully aware of the arrangements you have been discussing, and I am fully aware that I have been underestimated." Romy's eyes flicked briefly toward the nurse, then back to me, her posture rigid. "We were only trying to ensure the best outcome," she said, carefully, but the faint edge in her voice betrayed uncertainty. I nodded slowly, acknowledging her words without conceding any ground. "Ensuring outcomes does not require sidelining the person most invested," I said, my tone crisp. "I have managed more than this building, more than these papers. I have managed lives, and I have been ready to participate fully." The nurse glanced at the administrator, then at the documents, silently noting the shift in atmosphere. Wade exhaled again, a little faster this time. "I did not realize," he murmured, "how much you had already accomplished." I leaned forward slightly, making sure the subtle weight of the statement was felt. "You did not need to realize. You needed to remember who I am," I said. Romy's lips pressed together, and her eyes hardened slightly, but her voice faltered when she said, "I suppose there is more to consider." I nodded once, deliberately calm. Everything must be reconsidered. All arrangements, all decisions. Not as you see them, but as they should be, with full transparency and input from me. The administrator cleared his throat and set down the file, meeting my eyes. "Mrs. Myrtle, given your position and recent accomplishments, your role in every decision is now required." I allowed a brief pause, letting it settle in. "Required," I repeated softly. Wade shifted in his seat, finally meeting my gaze. "Mom, I did not know you had taken control so completely," he admitted quietly. I gave a measured nod. Control is earned quietly, not given. And it seems, finally, that the room understands that. Romy swallowed, her confidence momentarily shaken. "We underestimated you," she said, the words almost involuntary. I looked at her steadily. "That is correct, and it will not happen again." The nurse handed me a copy of the policy changes, and I signed with deliberate slowness, my pen tracing each line as if asserting permanence. When I placed the final signature down, I looked up and saw their faces. The surprise, the realization, the recognition that the person they had once tried to silence had become someone who could not be ignored. And in that instant, the quiet authority I had cultivated settled over the room like a tangible presence, leaving everyone in a momentary stillness that spoke louder than any argument could. For the first time in decades, I felt the weight of being fully acknowledged. Wade leaned back, Romy's hands unclenched slightly, and the administrator adjusted his chair, all watching, waiting. I smiled faintly, not triumphantly, but with the calm clarity of someone who had reclaimed her place. And then, as I looked around the room at the faces of those who had underestimated me, the quiet, almost imperceptible shock that rippled across each of them confirmed what I already knew. The game had changed, and I was no longer a player to be overlooked. I left the hospital conference room with a calmness that surprised even me. The corridor outside felt quieter now, as if the air itself had adjusted to what had just been decided inside. Behind me, I heard Wade's voice call out once, uncertain, "Mom, wait." I stopped, but did not turn immediately. When I finally faced him, he was standing near the doorway, Romy a step behind him, both of them no longer speaking in coordinated certainty. "Where did this all come from?" Wade asked, his voice lower now, less controlled. I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "From documents you signed without fully understanding their consequences," I said evenly. Romy stepped forward slightly. "We followed legal guidance," she insisted. I nodded once. "Yes, and legal guidance always leads back to intention. Someone initiated this process before I arrived today." That was when the hospital administrator stepped out behind them, holding a secondary folder that had not been opened during the meeting. "There is something else that needs to be clarified," he said carefully. Wade turned toward him. "What else?" The administrator opened the folder and placed a single printed document on the counter. "This was submitted 3 weeks ago by Mrs. Myrtle herself." Silence fell immediately. Romy's expression tightened. Wade blinked, confused. 3 weeks ago, he repeated. I did not look away from him. "Yes," I said calmly. "Before any of you decided what my role should be, I ensured I had already established one." The administrator continued. "It outlines full independent authority for community advisory operations and financial oversight within the program network she leads. It was approved at the municipal level last week." Wade stared at the document, then back at me. "You planned this?" he asked quietly. I answered without hesitation. "I prepared for it." Romy exhaled slowly, her confidence finally breaking into something less certain. "You let us believe we were in control," she said. I turned slightly toward her. "No, you assumed control because I allowed you space to assume it." The weight of that sentence settled between them. Wade looked down, running a hand through his hair. "I do not understand what changed," he admitted. I stepped closer, not aggressively, but enough that my presence filled the remaining distance. "Nothing changed," I said. "You simply stopped seeing what was already in motion." The administrator cleared his throat again. There are additional notes regarding financial restructuring tied to Mrs. Myrtle's program expansion, he added. It is already influencing funding allocations at the regional level. Romy finally looked directly at me, her voice lower now. You were never just stepping back, were you? I held her gaze. I was never stepping out. Wade looked between us, his expression shifting from confusion to something closer to recognition. So what happens now, he asked. I took a slow breath, letting the question settle before answering. Now, I said, I continue exactly as I intended, with or without approval. The corridor behind us was filling with movement again, staff passing, phones ringing, schedules continuing as if nothing monumental had just shifted. But something had. I could feel it in the way Wade no longer spoke over me, in the way Romy no longer interrupted, in the way silence had changed its shape between us. As I turned to leave, Wade spoke one last time, softer now. Mom, are we still family? I paused at the end of the corridor, not turning back immediately. When I finally spoke, my voice remained steady, measured, but not softened. That depends on what you choose next. I walked away before he could answer, the sound of their silence following me, unresolved and heavy, lingering long after the doors closed behind me. In the weeks that followed, the hospital corridor and its tense conversations became something I no longer revisited in my mind with urgency, but with distance. Life did not suddenly become perfect, but it became honest in a way it had never been before. My mornings were no longer shaped by waiting for calls that would not come. Instead, they were structured, purposeful, and mine. The community program continued to expand, and my role grew not because I demanded it, but because it functioned better when I was present. Wade reached out once, then again, each message more careful than the last. I did not respond immediately, not out of punishment, but out of clarity. Some bridges cannot be rebuilt in haste. They must be understood before they are crossed again. One afternoon, he appeared at the community center without warning. He stood near the entrance, holding a small paper bag, unsure whether to step inside. I noticed him before he spoke. Mom, he said quietly. I looked at him for a long moment, then gestured toward the bench outside. We sat together in silence at first, watching people pass by. I did not see you, he finally said. I nodded slowly. No, I replied. You saw what you were used to seeing. He lowered his head. I think I forgot how strong you are. I turned slightly toward him. Strength is not forgetting pain, I said softly. It is no longer letting it define your direction. He was quiet for a long time after that. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no sudden repair of everything that had broken. Only understanding forming slowly, like something rebuilding its shape in quiet air. As the sun began to lower, I stood, and Wade followed. I do not know what comes next, he admitted. I looked at him, not with expectation, but with acceptance. Neither do I said. But I know what I will no longer accept. That evening, I returned home and placed my badge on the table beside a small framed photo of Noelle. I no longer saw it as a symbol of authority alone, but as a reminder of endurance, of becoming someone who no longer disappears inside silence. The house felt different now, not because it had changed, but because I had. Before turning off the light, I stood for a moment in the doorway, letting the quiet settle around me like something familiar rather than something empty. And in that stillness, I understood that healing is not the return to what was lost, but the arrival of who we become when we stop abandoning ourselves. If you are listening to this and you feel unseen, I want you to know something gently, without demand. Your worth does not decrease in the places where others fail to recognize it. Sometimes life removes people not to punish you, but to reveal you. Trust that quiet voice inside you that tells you when enough is enough, even when no one else agrees. Take care of your boundaries, your peace, your finances, and your emotional truth, because those are not luxuries, they are foundations. This is Myrtle, and my age is 71. And the lesson I carry from all of this is simple but unshakable. You are never required to shrink in order to be loved. And if this story reached you, I thank you for being here, for listening, for staying through the silence. If you wish, you may share your thoughts below, or simply leave a word so others know they are not alone. There are more stories like this waiting, stories of silence, truth, and return, and they continue in the next chapter, where new beginnings often start in the most unexpected ways, where what was once broken begins to speak again. and where those who were once unseen slowly step back into the light.